Hello and welcome to my review of the recently released PS4 remake of the PS1 classic, MediEvil. Now, last Halloween I actually reviewed the original MediEvil game released in 1998 for the PS1, so if you're interested in that base original experience, you could check that video out. I'll leave a link to it below in the description. For now though, let's stick with something a little bit more modern and take a look at MediEvil 2019. This review is going to be primarily taking a look at the changes that the remake has made to the original game, rather than reviewing it as its own entity. So if you're interested in what the changes are and if they're good or not and make the game worth buying, you might find this interesting. So the most immediate changes you'll notice are that the graphics have been completely overhauled and upgraded. Everything is in HD, in widescreen, with way higher quality animations and lighting effects than what was possible back in 1998 when the original MediEvil was released. While this huge jump in quality is to be expected with it being 3 console generations ahead, you still have to give the team at Other Ocean credit for staying so faithful to the original art style, while also adding some really nice attention to detail. Like how when you collect a chalice and go to the Hall of Heroes now, the chalice will actually appear on the table, so your progress through the game actually has a physical presence. Or there's also the little detail where the shop merchant gargoyles will now eat the coins that you feed to them. The world of Gallowmere just feels a lot more dynamic and alive because of the graphical improvements, and it's clear that the developers had a deep love of the original game. Another change which is very welcome in my opinion is how the controls have been remapped to better suit modern game conventions. Rather than using the L2 and R2 buttons to rotate the camera, using circle to jump and X to attack, and using the D-pad to move, you instead use the left analog stick to move, the right analog stick controls the camera, and X is now jump and square is attack. Veterans of the original game may take a while to adjust to this, but if you don't like it, the game even has you covered with a classic control style which more closely mimics the layout of the original PS1 game's controls. The camera can now be fully controlled manually, rather than in the PS1 game where it could only be rotated left and right around Sir Dan. This is great because it feels so much more natural, but also allows you to actually look around properly and take in the environments, which you'll probably want to be doing because they're all gorgeous and varied to boot. You can also go into a Dan cam mode, which moves the camera to an over-the-shoulder perspective to get a better look at your surroundings. You can't play the game properly from this camera position though, because, well, number 1, you'd have to hold the L2 button down for the whole game, and number 2, Dan can't run while in this mode either. It's a bit of a shame because I feel like the game could have felt really different and potentially even a bit more modern with this camera style. The game also has a tendency to make the camera fade to black and then fade back in again if it collides with a wall or if you enter an area with a preset camera location. And this can be a bit awkward in certain situations, because when the camera fades back in, you might not know where you're positioned in relation to where the camera just was. In one section, this actually resulted in me walking straight into a pit because I thought it was the exit to a cave I had just entered. Either way though, even if the game's camera is a little bit annoying at times, it's still better than in the original game, so at least there's that. The game is an incredibly faithful remake of the original game, and while some could argue that that's a positive because as a remake it shouldn't be too different to the original experience, and I do see the logic in that opinion somewhat, but I also kind of feel like the best remakes are the ones that are quite drastically different from the source material and shape it into something new. Probably the best examples of video game remakes that I've played are the 2019 Resident Evil 2, which fairly drastically deviates from the PS1 game it's based on in several ways, and Bionic Commando Rearmed, which, while uses the same base level design, also adds in brand new characters and story arcs, new minigames, a totally remixed soundtrack, multiplayer, new modes, and way more. MediEvil 2019, on the other hand, doesn't really do too much that the original didn't already do. That isn't to say it's a bad game though, it's still insanely enjoyable, and I think that's a testament to just how well the original game still holds up. All of the variety in level design, in terms of it sometimes being straightforward and about making it to the end of a level, sometimes being about collecting a certain number of objects, sometimes being a more platforming focused level, sometimes being more combat focused, sometimes being a fetch quest, sometimes having boss battles implemented into the levels, and all of these amazing design ideas are still here and still make the game really engaging from start to finish. It hardly ever feels like you're doing the same thing twice. But then at the same time, all of the flaws that were present in the original game are also still here. The most disappointing thing about the remake is that it doesn't fix the thing that was probably the worst about the original game: the combat. It pretty much just boils down to spamming the attack button and tanking your way through enemies. It doesn't have any weight to it, and there's not enough feedback when you land a hit. As well as that though, there's just hardly any tactical element at all. Almost every enemy can be killed with a few sword hits, and even on the rare occasion where they can't be, like for example if they're a flying enemy or if they're these big knights, you then either just switch to a ranged weapon and spam that, or spam the attack button like usual and knock the knights into the water. It's such a shame because there's such a massive variety in the weapons that you unlock and in the enemy's visual design, but there's not really any interest in utilization of the weapons, and the enemy design at the end of the day doesn't impact the gameplay. The new weapons you unlock basically just end up replacing your old weapons and you never use them again. The ranged combat has been improved somewhat because you can now use dancam to sort of manually aim, but it's just not enough to save the bare bones combat system here. Also, entering dancam is a bit clunky, and the reason for this is because when you enter it, it goes to the direction Dan is facing rather than the direction you're aiming the camera. So naturally, if you wanted to aim at an enemy, you'd move the camera to look at them and then aim, right? But in this game, you'd do that and then the camera would move in the complete opposite direction because the odds are Dan isn't looking in the direction you just moved the camera to. It's actually quite disorientating and left me hardly ever using the dancam function and just sticking to the auto aim. We've been on a bit of a downer for a while now, so let's pick things up again by saying that the music and sound design are fantastic. The voice acting, in my opinion, is superb. It can be quite over the top at times, but I found it funny, and the writing is still just as great as it was back on the PS1. I still love how the game subverts expectations by having staples of the fantasy genre have these ridiculous character traits. Like how the fairies are bald men with stubble and speak like they're an EastEnders character or a London gangster.
Thank you for releasing me, sir. My people wish only to live our lives in blissful harmony with nature. But alas, the wicked Egg Queen has many of us imprisoned. Rescue my people, Mr. Fortescue, and you will be richly rewarded.
I swear as well that the vast majority of voice actors must have returned to reprise the roles from the original game, because some of these voices are just spot on identical to what they were in the original, so that was really nice to hear. The music as well is incredible. The orchestral tunes feel way more grand and epic than they ever have before, and I've been humming the main theme tune of the game ever since hearing it. It's ridiculously catchy. I love how they've made the soundtrack dynamic now too, getting more intense when in combat and going into this really mellow version when you're browsing the Merchant Gargoyle's wares. Despite me saying earlier that the game doesn't change too much from the original PS1 game, it does make a few small tweaks, but most of these boil down to quality of life improvements. However, there are a couple of changes that are much more impressive than that. Firstly, let's start off with something kind of minor. Certain item placements have now been slightly altered, but I never really noticed anything being moved substantially. And I feel like whenever this was done, it was either because it simply makes more sense for the item to be somewhere else, like in the case of the short sword in Dan's crypt, which in the original game is just floating there as soon as you get control, whereas in the remake it's placed at the end of this corridor next to a statue, which I feel makes more sense in the context of the game's universe, because why would it have been placed so randomly like that in the original game? Or there's a few examples where items have been added or moved to make use of the new camera, where when things used to be in the open, they can now be hidden behind something. I like these changes, but really, they don't impact the game in the slightest. There's now a quick weapon swap where you can assign a primary and secondary weapon and switch between them with the press of a button, rather than having to pause the game and enter the inventory just to swap your weapons like you had to in the original. It just makes the game flow better and is a nice, but small, improvement. There's also a new item menu, which I'll be honest, I actually don't think is as good as the original game's menu. In the original it was arranged so that there were several rows, one for weapons, one for items, and it felt like everything was neatly arranged and you could always get to what you wanted fast. In the remake though, everything is on one row and you press L1 or R1 to cycle to melee weapons, ranged weapons, items and armour. While this is fine, I don't think it's as intuitive as the original game, so that was very slightly disappointing. Something that I wasn't expecting is that certain bosses have been fairly drastically changed, having new phases which weren't present in the original game. Like here with the Pumpkin Serpent, who now has multiple phases where you need to go and kill his respawning roots. Or here where during the Pirate Captain fight, it rains, putting out your fiery club and forcing you to use the captain's bombs to light the cannon to fire back at him. It's actually really cool, and I wish the developers had made more changes like this to give long-time fans something new and unexpected. There's also a new encyclopedia which gets filled in as you progress through the game, and you encounter new enemies, friends and bosses. I like this because it adds another layer of progression onto the game because you're wanting to fill in all of the entries, but also it expands the lore of the game by giving you more detail on some of the inhabitants of Gallowmere. What's also awesome is that you don't just have to read the articles, because there's voice acting for all of them done by the same disembodied voice from the start of the game.
In a time long ago, there lived in the kingdom of Gallowmere a sorcerer named Xerok.
Wait a minute, that voice. I know that I've heard that somewhere before.
In the age of ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog.
It's confirmed, you heard it here first. MediEvil is the Dark Souls of action-adventure games. You think I'm joking, but then you get to the bit where Sir Dan escapes the undead asylum by being picked up by a massive bird, then you'll see. I'm not kidding.
Only in the ancient legends it is stated that one day an undead shall meet. Leave the undead asylum in pilgrimage.
See what I mean? MediEvil, straight up is Dark Souls. Other content added into the remake that wasn't in the original comes in the form of trophies, which I know some people don't care about, but it gives you a list of objectives to complete, and some of them you probably wouldn't normally do. Like defeating the stained glass demon with just your arm, or completing the sleeping village without damaging any of the innocent people. It's pretty cool, and I'm glad they were inventive with some of the tasks you need to complete to unlock these. But I know what you're thinking, is there any extra content that's in the game itself? And yes, it turns out there actually is. Near the end of the game you'll encounter the Lost Souls. These souls then appear in every single level in the game, so you'll have to replay the entire game again to track these things down and collect them. However, it's not as simple as just collecting them. Once you've actually found them, you'll be given a bit of a riddle as to a location in the game where the lost souls want to be placed. You'll then need to track down this exact location and use the soul, which will then start a sort of mini-game. Some of these are actually really interesting, and some of them are pretty funny. But the important thing here is that this is quite a big chunk of content that wasn't in the original game, and this gives fans something new to chew on. This is exactly the sort of thing that I wanted more of. It's a bit of a shame this sort of thing wasn't done more frequently. One of the coolest Lost Soul missions is this one where you return to the Witcher's old grounds and are shrunk in order to get rid of the ants infesting the area. You get to see this really familiar location in a brand new way and with enemies present that shouldn't be there, and it's a really awesome thing to experience. Some of you might be asking though, what happens when you lay all of the Lost Souls to rest? Well, if you're at all interested in playing the game for yourself, or if you're a fan of the original game and are on the fence about the remake, you should probably skip to this time in the video because there's a spoiler coming up that ruins what I think is potentially one of the best completion rewards in any game ever. So yeah, if you don't want spoilers, skip to here. Are you gone? Good. When you collect and lay to rest every lost soul in the entire game, basically having finished the game twice at this point, once just doing the game normally and once for the post-game Lost Souls collectibles, you're told that you've unlocked something special on the main menu. Upon going back to the main menu, you discover that there's a new option called Old Game. This made me laugh because that's such a stupid way to word it, but at the same time, it makes sense given what it does. Because yes, selecting this option lets you play the original PS1 MediEvil in full on your PS4. Let that just sink in for a minute. The remake of MediEvil isn't just a remake, but also lets you play the original game too. Also, is this the only PS1 game that's playable on the PS4? I know Final Fantasy VII is on the PS4, but I assume that's been recoded to work properly, and it's not the exact same game that you'd get on the PS1, with it having some new features. Whereas this feels like straight up emulation. If the PS4 is capable of this, why haven't PS1 games been available to buy? It's so weird. I honestly think that this could be the best completion reward in any video game ever. I mean, it automatically has to mean that the remake of MediEvil is the definitive version, because the original version is inside of it regardless. I almost wonder what happens when you 100% the original version. Imagine if you unlocked MediEvil 2 or MediEvil Resurrection. Just how deep could the rabbit hole go? Anyway, I think that about sums up the remake of MediEvil. It's incredibly faithful to the original game, and while that's great because it maintains the fantastic story of Sedan's redemption after he's instantly killed on the battlefield, and yet falsely remembered as a hero, but then is given a second chance after becoming undead, it's still got the fantastic level of variety with its objectives. The graphics are still mesmerising and a joy to explore, perhaps even more so with these enhanced visuals, and the music and sound design is still really amazing. However, it being so faithful also means that the awkward camera, poor and unsatisfying combat mechanics, rubbish rewards from the Hall of Heroes, especially later on in the game where you just get given gold or health, and somewhat clunky platforming are all problems that we see return too. There's not a lot of extra content here for veterans of the game either. The Lost Souls are a truly amazing addition that give the game a lot more value because its length is quite drastically extended by doing all of these quests, and the trophies offer a nice set of objectives that can be challenging and interesting to complete. But in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't alter the game in any drastic way. The developers were quite clearly aiming to be as faithful as possible to the original game, and while I respect that, I probably would have enjoyed a remake of the game a bit more if it would have had a completely different combat system, maybe more like a 3D Zelda game or, dare I say it, Dark Souls, and just some more original content to sink my teeth into. However, this is still the definitive version of the game, and I enjoyed my time with it so much that I got the Platinum Trophy on it, and I'm still craving more. I really hope that the developers of the game, Other Ocean, get the opportunity to make a remake of MediEvil 2, or potentially just a brand new game in the series altogether. They did a really fantastic job with this remake, and really achieved everything they set out to do with it. I'm giving MediEvil 2019 a 7 out of 10. Which is actually the exact same score I gave to the original, and I didn't even know that. I just looked that up as I was writing this bit of the script, so that's quite fitting really, considering that it's practically the same game. What to take away from this is just how good the original game is to still, without too many changes being made to it, be this great. It's quite underappreciated actually, so I'm glad this remake exists to introduce more people to it. A question I want to ask is that what do you think makes a good remake? Is it a straight up recreation that sticks as close to the source material as possible? Or is it something which uses the source material as inspiration and creates something almost entirely new, but takes elements from the original? With films, I definitely fall into the second category. I don't see the point in remaking a film unless you're going to take it in a brand new direction. John Carpenter's The Thing is my go-to example of this, because it's almost not even a remake because it changes so much from the original. But it's an incredible film that uses the fundamental idea of the original to create something amazing. Even with music, I don't see the point in covering a song unless you're going to change it and make it into something new. But with games, I feel like the lines are a lot more blurred. Even then though, I feel like I can enjoy a faithful remake, but a remake that changes lots can become something really interesting. And plus it has the added benefit of not completely replacing the original game either, because they're so different and therefore both have value. Let me know your opinion in the comments. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me on that topic. That was MediEvil on the PS4. I hope you enjoyed the review, and until next time, bye!